Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Hoffecker. He is fellow of the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research. He specializes in archaeology and human paleoecology. His primary research focus is the global dispersal of anatomically modern humans, and is also the author of several books, including Modern Humans, Their African Origin and Global Dispersal, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today. So, Dr. Hoffecker, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. So let me start with this question, because if I understood it correctly, in your book, you focus a lot or put a lot of emphasis on the evolution of the human hand and also our vocal tract. Why are those so important in order to understand how we evolved?
Both of those organs have evolved a unique function in our species, and their function is to translate semantic information in the brain to some form of structure outside the brain. And in the case of the hand, of course, that's obvious. We make all kinds of complicated objects with the hand. We also use it to make physical material symbols, drawing and writing and so forth. The vocal tract might be a little bit less obvious, but nevertheless, the sounds that you and I are generating right now in our conversation have a material form, of course. And they also have a very complex structure. So that they seem rather ephemeral, both in space and time. They too represent a physical structure that's being created by this organ, the vocal tract, and it has a potentially very complex structure because of the way we use language. Of course, we also do something analogous with our hands when we're either doing art or designing artifacts or features or whatever. When we're creating these structures with language, we have an potentially infinite variety of possibilities, don't we? We can construct any sentence of potentially infinite length. We can go on and on and on, and as I am now, and we can rearrange the words and the phrases and so forth in potentially infinite number of ways. And it's the structure is very complex hierarchically, and that's so both of these are unique. There's no other animal that creates these complex hierarchical structures out of these two anatomical organs.
Mm-hmm. So don't they also provide the basis for our complex culture? Because as you were speaking and explaining why these two organs, let's say, are so important for us, I was just thinking that maybe they are crucial to understanding how we evolved our complex cultures. I mean, other animals also have cultures, but they are less complex, right?
Yes, that's right. No, you're absolutely right. That is the basis for almost everything we think of as human. All of our complex technology and our art and literature and everything, of religion and our ideas about the universe and each other, including human evolution and books on modern humans. It's all a product of these two organs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So still talking about that, I mean, we can use our hands to manipulate objects and to create technology. Is there any relationship between how we do that and language? I mean, between how we manipulate objects and create technology and how we speak?
Yes, I think that they're essentially the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I believe it was André Leroi-Gourhan, the great French prehistorian, who said they are essentially the same thing. Language and artifacts it's the same process. I think actually, I mean, I suppose I would modify that statement a little bit in that some of the structures that we create, both with our hands as well as with our vocal tract, are symbolic. They refer to something else. And and of course, some of those structures, the structures that we create with the hand, of course, include many artifacts and features that we use to solve practical problems, such as how to stay warm, or how to find some food to eat, or make some food. And so there is that distinction, of course, in the two types of structures that we create. But I think fundamentally the process of creating those structures is the same. And I think that the key point here is that because of the way our brains work, we can substitute again an almost infinite range of possibilities here when we're making up sentences and paragraphs and books and so forth on the one hand, or if we're designing tools and artifacts, we can change the design, we can make something else, we can keep on trying out new possibilities, there's no limit to it, particularly because of the complex hierarchical structure we have both with language and with artifacts.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that culture, and also perhaps focusing on these two aspects of our evolution that we've been talking about, that they might have created some novel evolutionary pressures, let's say, and redirected even the way our genetic evolution occurred?
Yes, I do. I mean, one of the main points in the book on modern humans is that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, represents a major transition in evolution. I mean, not just the major transition in the evolution of hominines, of humans, or even primates or mammals, but in the whole evolutionary process, because it represents some entirely new process that has developed, has effectively emerged with the appearance, the evolution and the spread of anatomically modern humans. So there's a fundamental change, I think, and this is a minority position. Most of my colleagues think it's overstatement, exaggeration, that the differences between modern humans and our immediate predecessors, including our Neanderthal and Denisovan cousins, are not that great. That it's just simply a question of degree, I suppose. It's a relatively minor change, and my argument or my hypothesis or whatever, that we are looking at a major fundamental change in the evolutionary process is probably accepted by only a small minority of my colleagues, maybe almost nobody. My advisor, my former PhD advisor, might be one of the few exceptions. I think he's argued that for years. Richard Klein at Stanford University has argued this for a long time, and my work has, of course, been heavily influenced by his work. But we're a small minority in the field of paleoanthropology.
Yeah, and talking about modern humans, when you say modern humans, are you referring only to Homo sapiens, or do you also include other species that came before?
No, I'm using the term modern humans. Modern humans, of course, is a common term, right? It's not a Linnaean classification. Modern humans, in this case, would be the common term for the genus species, the genus Homo and the species sapiens, Homo sapiens. And that includes more than just, ourselves, more than just the living human population and our immediate ancestors, all those the living lineages that developed in Africa, L0 and 1, 2, 3, and all of the daughter lineages that spread across Eurasia and ultimately the whole world. It includes a larger group than that. It includes a number of anatomically modern people who were living in Africa and occasionally moved out of Africa, at least to a limited extent, before 60,000 years ago, but do not seem to have. They do not exhibit the full range of our capacity for this, infinite creativity with words and artifacts. So modern humans is a term that includes all Homo sapiens, including, for instance, the people who were living at Jebel Irhoud Morocco 300,000 years ago. That's Homo sapiens. That's also modern humans. But that's not us really. Those are our distant cousins who apparently didn't make it. Were either went extinct or were replaced by ourselves, our own immediate ancestors. But that's how I define modern humans. So that includes a number of people. There are varieties of Homo sapiens that exhibit some anatomical features that we consider to be archaic, okay, such as a lack of a chin, heavy brow ridges, that kind of thing. We see that, for instance, in the modern human fossils from Israel, say about 100,000 years ago, in places like Kafsa, which exhibit, again, some of these archaic features that we don't find among ourselves. So that's how you could. Sometimes they are referred to as near modern, as opposed to modern humans.
Yeah, at a certain point there, you mentioned that you also include, for example, Homo sapiens that lived in Morocco around 300,000 years ago. So is that, have anthropologists already pushed back the date of our origins to 300,000 years ago? Because I was just thinking that until recently, people thought that Homo sapiens originated between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago.
Yeah, we have. So it's largely a question of dating here, okay? Because there's some new dates, some optical stimulated luminescence dates were obtained on the Jebel Hood fossils. The fossils themselves have been known for many decades, but these luminescence dates are new, and that effectively doubled the age of the earliest anatomically modern people. But again, it was stressed that those are not the folks that wind up marching out of Africa 60,000 years ago and wind up in places like Beringia in Australia.
Yeah, and before Homo sapiens, were there other hominin species that migrated out of Africa, and what species were those, and where did they go?
It's kind of interesting because there is a real pattern in human evolution that repeats itself over and over again, and that is that we have evolutionary developments in Africa. More often than not, they seem to involve increases in brain size. Yeah. And then they are followed by a migration of those people, of that African population, out of Africa into Eurasia. That seems to happen at least 3 or 4 times or more. It happens with the earliest form of Homo, early Homo, which is developing at some point around 2.5 million years ago or something, in sub-Saharan Africa. And within a very short period of time, we see one of the most amazing events, to me anyway, one of the most amazing events in human evolution, which is that this tropical form of large primate shows up in places like the Caucasus region and northern China, 40 degrees latitude, 40 degrees north. It's an amazing transformation. It seems to take place very rapidly, and it indicates that whatever happened around 2.5 million years ago in Africa had an enormous impact on the capacity of at least this group of hominins to adapt to a much wider range of environments and climate zones. I mean, basically, a group of animals that had been confined to the tropical zone, equatorial zone, for millions and millions of years, is showing up in the temperate zone, is showing up in places like southern Europe maybe, but certainly the Caucasus region, which is out like the back door to Europe, and again in northern China. So that's one. That's the first. Okay, then there appears to be another migration out of Africa about 1.5 million years ago. These are the hand axe makers. Okay, they suddenly show up in places like the Levant, and and eventually, of course, further north.
Let me just interrupt you there. Are we already talking about Homo erectus?
Yeah, we're talking about a larger brained Homo form that's showing up around. These would be probably the people who made all those nice hand axes at Orlega in East Africa, and then they show up in Israel about again at some point before 1 million years ago. Then there is a major movement of large-brained humans, Homo, about 500,000 years ago, about 600,000 years ago. That's Homo heidelbergensis. Many people refer to this group by that name, obviously originally defined in Europe. And that group, that migration, which again represents another jump in brain size, up to over 1,000 cubic centimeters, 1,200, whatever. That group, that migration then essentially gives birth to both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans in Eurasia, and then there appear to be several movements out of Africa by modern humans, by anatomically modern humans, that precede the global dispersal, which doesn't take place until 60, maybe 70,000 years ago. Begins at that point. So yes, the answer is yes. There have been multiple movements of early humans out of Africa. It's a process that repeats itself over and over again. And I find it very interesting. One might be inclined to assume that what happens in human evolution is that early humans migrate out of Africa. They occupy places that are colder and less rich biologically than the savannas of East Africa, places where you get colder winter temperatures and where the biological productivity, both the plants and animals, is significantly lower than it would be in the tropics, and that humans then adapt to these more challenging environments, and that we then see evolutionary advances in humans accordingly. That doesn't want to happen, and it seems that all of the significant evolutionary advances in human evolution seem to be coming in Africa. And they initially, anyway, with the appearance of Homo, it's conceivably related to an expansion into drier and less productive environments in Africa. I suspect that's a key factor in the evolution of early Homo. But after that, it seems to me that you'd have to look for alternative explanations for why you get these evolutionary advances, which again often seem to be connected to increases in brain size. My suspicion is that it's it's a complex social life that is the challenges of a complex social life, of forming alliances and manipulating friendships and alliances, that kind of thing, that's really driving the increases in brain size, and ultimately lies behind these successive expansions out of Africa.
So the fact that these Homo species before Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa, does that by itself tell us something about their social complexity and maybe the technology that they already had developed? Because I was imagining that to be able to survive in different environments, in more challenging environments, I mean, Homo species back then would have to have some, at least, basic cognitive abilities and complex social life, and also some technology that allowed them to do that.
Yes, that's right. What I've argued in the Modern Humans book is that it looks to me anyway as though it's the complexities of social life that are really driving these increases in brain size and in computational complexity, the ability to compute more complex problems in terms of the number of steps involved, and the amount of memory that has to be stored in order to perform the computation. And looks to me as though that it's the social life that's the real driver here, and that the complexity of the technology that eventually becomes evident is a byproduct of that. And many of my colleagues accept a hypothesis for the steady increase in brain size that begins around 2 million years ago and continues right up to modern humans. And I accept it also. I think it makes a great deal of sense, which is known as the social brain hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And this has been this Robin Dunbar and several of his colleagues. And their argument is that it's this constant pressure on computational ability, on our ability to compute, strategize socially from 2 million years on, that is driving this steady increase in brain size. And we can see the steady increase in the fossil record. Brains just keep getting larger and larger and larger and larger. And I think of modern humans really as being sort of the end of the line, right? Where the human brain becomes so grotesquely oversized, relative to other animals, that it reaches a limit. It's partly to do with the birth canal and so forth, but I think it also is a thermoregulatory issue as well, because the brain eventually gets to the size at which it's very difficult to keep it cool, particularly in a tropical setting, and so it reaches a limit. It's also very expensive in terms of its metabolic requirements, its caloric requirements, right? It takes a lot of food. High quality food to lots of protein and so forth to feed such an enormous brain. So I think modern humans is kind of the crisis, really. It seems to me, where the brain just cannot get any bigger, and so then instead you get this very dramatic change, which has to do with maturation, with childhood learning and so forth, in which the brain is being basically constructed during childhood through language and all this learning that we go through, and we see what seems to me to be an enormous jump in computational complexity and the ability to compute these very, very difficult problems, because you essentially kind of restructured the brain through learning. And we see, for me, the change in the archaeological record is very clear, and we see modern humans marching across northern Eurasia, about 45,000 years ago, probably a little bit earlier than that, and it's clear that they're bringing with them all of this suddenly very complicated technology, mechanical instruments, snares and traps, bow and arrow or spear throwers. We see evidence of insulated clothing, tailored clothing, which is terribly complex with many, many different hierarchical components and subcomponents. Probably also mechanical, because you need drawstrings in order to tighten the hoods and mittens and boots and so forth. So it counts as a mechanical technology. But this is something we don't see in any other form of human, right? Only that subset of modern humans that marches out of Africa about 60,000 years ago. And we have evidence for this complex technology in Africa shortly before that too. So it doesn't just pop up when people show up in places like Siberia. It's there at the beginning, and it clearly is critical to the global dispersal, in my view anyway. And it reflects again this some kind of enormous increase in computational complexity, computational power. And the real difference, I think, the real contrast here is in the computational power, the required computational complexity of designing this complicated technology, which is it's basically the technology of living hunter-gatherers, right? Including the people who live in places like the Arctic and the subarctic, places in northeastern Asia, and it lived in Canada. The Inuit, people like that, who had the most complex technology among living or recent hunter-gatherers. A lot of machinery, a lot of self-acting devices and machines, big boats, and all kinds of mechanical hunting and fishing gear, and then a very complex technology for shelter and protection. Winter houses, semi-subterranean winter houses, with entrance tunnels and stuff that control the air temperature and all that kind of thing. And that's, so that's critical to the global dispersal. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. You can't live in places where it's 40 below zero in wintertime unless you've got this complex technology. And there's no evidence that the Neanderthals or the Denisovans or any other earlier humans possessed this. So that's, I see that very complex technology as being a kind of critical archaeological evidence or signal for this revolutionary, this fundamental change in computational power and increased computational complexity that's associated with modern people.
Yeah.
Modern humans.
Yeah, so let's just take some steps back, and going back again to the question of out of Africa migrations before Homo sapiens. Did Homo erectus or any other Homo species before Homo sapiens reach places like Australia and islands of the Pacific? Because I was just remembering species like Homo florizensis, or I'm not sure if this is the correct name or the correct pronunciation, that appeared in the island of Flores in the Pacific. And if I remember correctly, they didn't derive from Homo sapiens, but from another species. Is that correct?
Well, there's a debate over that. I must confess I haven't been following it terribly closely, but my understanding is that the consensus is that Floriensis is related to modern humans, and that what we have here is instead is some rather unusual anatomical adaptations that developed on an island isolation, and not some remnant of the Australopithecines or something like that. But generally speaking, it looks like non-modern humans do not do any significant voyaging. Okay, we do have evidence of Homo erectus and Homo ergaster and others reaching some nearshore islands and so forth, but we don't have anyone other than modern humans in Australia, for instance, which requires a minimum of I think 50 or 60 kilometers voyage in open water, and then once modern humans do show up, we see some very dramatic voyages, well over 100 kilometers out to, I think it's some of the islands in the Southwest Pacific, by about 35,000 years ago. So that, this sophisticated navigational technology, marine technology, that's something else that seems to come along with anatomically modern humans. And I think for me, my focus is on the northern hemisphere, particularly cold environments. And so, what I'm looking at is the appearance of modern humans in places like Beringia, which happens no later than 33,000. We have modern humans up in the high Arctic at 70 degrees north latitude, near the mouth of the Yana River in extreme Northeast Asia, and a place that many people consider to be part of Beringia. So that reflects again this extraordinary jump and quantum jump in the ability of modern humans to deal with environments that their predecessors were completely unable to cope with.
So let's now talk about, let's get closer to the period where Homo sapiens left Africa and the species they interacted with. So we have the Denisovans and Homo neanderthal. I think that Neanderthals were spread more or less across Europe, right? And the Denisovans were in Northern Asia, if I'm not mistaken. Do they have a common ancestor, or did they evolve from two different species?
No, they have the Neanderthals and Denisovans fairly closely related, and they are those two lineages can be traced back to ultimately to our own earlier lineage, right? It looks as though you have this large-brained form of Homo, roughly 500,000 years ago in Africa, that is the common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and ourselves, modern humans.
Mm-hmm.
And we're the African branch, right? Okay. The Neanderthals, as you say, they're present in Europe. They also show up in the Levant, and they actually show up in southwestern Siberia. We have Neanderthal remains in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, which is southwestern Siberia. The Denisovans they're also in Denisova Cave. That's where they were first discovered, but they also almost certainly were present in southern Asia, because the genetics of modern humans indicate that there was major interbreeding between ourselves, our own ancestors, particularly certain groups in southern Asia and the Pacific region, and the Denisovans. The Melanesians, living Melanesians, carry I think up to 66% of the Denisovan genome. And so that indicates, even though we don't have a robust fossil record at this point, I guess it's being debated these days. The Denisovans almost certainly were in southern Asia. In fact, it looks to me like that was their primary center, population center, right? Was southern Asia, not Siberia.
In terms of the origins of Homo sapiens, where does the evidence point to? I mean, did we have a single origin or multiple origins? I mean, was it just one single population that evolved to Homo sapiens, or were there Homo sapiens from different regions?
Well, I think my own suspicion is that it's that modern humans, again, that we're a subset of this larger group of Homo sapiens, that specifically we're probably coming out of southern Africa. You mentioned in your messages earlier that paper in Nature last year, which is consistent with a number of other genetic studies, and also some linguistics, by the way, pointing to southern Africa as being the original home of ourselves, our own living humans.
Yeah, in the case of that paper, it would be northern Botswana, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about we're talking. It's somewhere in southern Africa, and it looks like maybe southwestern part of the continent. It looks as though that's the home of our own immediate ancestors of the people who migrated out of Africa about 60 or 70,000 years ago, and presumably we replaced our close relatives in Africa. These would have been the descendants of the folks living up at Jebel or Hood, as well as other people in perhaps in East Africa. Many or even perhaps all of whom were near moderns, had some of these archaic anatomical features we're talking about. There's genetic evidence for some interbreeding with some of these near moderns, and maybe even some other groups of Homo that weren't near moderns, that represented even more distantly related forms of Homo that were still around in Africa, say 70 or 100,000 years ago. But that's it's a two-stage process. Then we see the fundamental modern human anatomical pattern developing by 300,000 years at the latest, and that it looks like that perhaps is a gradual process, right? And that's we see that all across the continent of Africa. and then we have at least a couple of limited migrations out of Africa, these people, of these anatomically modern people. And then within that group, probably in southern Africa, we have this later development of our own immediate ancestors. And then those become the people who ultimately occupy all of Africa, and then eventually the entire world.
Mm-hmm. So those Homo sapiens that migrated out of Africa, were they already the ones that, I mean, when we mention the cognitive revolution that occurred around 50 to 70,000 years ago, with art, religion, paintings, all of that, did they already have those cultural features?
Well, it's difficult to tell. One of the things that we see in the Jebeler Hood material, the stuff that was the fossils that recently have been dated to as early as 300,000 years ago and are in North Africa and are, again, we assume are not our direct ancestors, but rather a related group of anatomically modern people, is that we get this evidence for this dramatic delay in maturation, this extended childhood, right? We see that in the teeth, which show this very protracted process of maturation, this extended childhood. And that's, I mean, we know from our colleagues in linguistics and in study of language that there's this critical learning period in our childhood where we need to be exposed to modern language, fully syntactic language, right? And if we are somehow denied that exposure, and that occasionally happens, it's very rare, but it does occasionally happen, it's almost impossible for us to subsequently acquire a fully syntactic language. We're limited then to a simpler non-syntactic form of language, and so that clearly then is that delayed maturation, that extended childhood, for which we have no evidence in earlier people. Like early Homo had a much shorter childhood, right? The growth of the brain is much faster in Homo erectus, for instance. We know that from the fossil record.
But this delayed maturation, was it gradual? I mean, if we move along the different species that came before Homo sapiens, do we see a gradual increase in their period of maturation or not?
It seems like it looks. I mean, we only have isolated data points, so it's hard to be sure. But last time I looked, the evidence we had on, for instance, Homo heidelbergensis was that the Homo heidelbergensis was much closer to the early Homo, or even the ape pattern of rapid growth, rapid maturation, and also rapid growth of the brain. After birth, very quick. We have Homo erectus fossils which show like 85% growth of the brain by the time the child is several years old, which is, of course, for us, for living humans, it's like 20 years to reach full growth of the brain. It's like 10 times the amount of time involved in growing a chimpanzee brain, for example, which is already 50% of its adult size at birth anyway, and our brains are only 25% of our adult size at birth. So there's much more growth involved, and it takes much longer than in apes and in early humans, it seems. And it's, I guess, the answer to your question, I'm kind of starting to babble here. The answer to your question is that it looks as though that delayed maturation is something that takes place rather quickly, fairly late in human evolution. And it looks as though the Neanderthals, for instance, had a much shorter childhood. and did not necessarily have this critical learning period, which suggests that maybe they did not have a fully syntactic language, although it's impossible to be sure about that.
Yeah. So before we get into out of Africa migrations by Homo sapiens and the places they went to, let me just ask you this. So when trying to understand the cognition of modern humans, do you think that it's more important for us to look at biology or culture, or do you think that we should look at both equally? I mean, does one of them have more weight here or not?
Well, I think certainly it's the non-genetic component. It's it's the software, right? And again, I think it's childhood learning, extended childhood, the learning of language and all of the technical skills that we acquire as we're growing up. That's I think overwhelmingly the critical part here. The biological part that's so important. I mean, obviously, having a large brain is critical. But again, it's the extended childhood and this extended learning period that is obviously controlled by genetics, but which, of course, has no role at all in the content of what's going into your brain, as you're being educated and growing up.
So we start moving out of Africa. What is the time frame that we are talking about here? I mean, what is more or less the period where Homo sapiens?
So we have evidence for at least a couple of early limited movements of modern humans out of Africa, and it looks as though those movements were made by the near modern people. Okay, they were anatomically, they were sort of officially Homo sapiens, but although they had these archaic features, but they didn't get very far. It looks as though they occupied the Arabian Peninsula, they occupy the Levant. They may be in parts of southern Asia. That's a controversy because we're arguing over these teeth in places like Luna Cave in China and so forth. Teeth that are maybe 100, 10,000 years old. There's an argument over, who those teeth actually represent. But we're pretty confident that these early migrations of near modern people did not make it into the northern hemisphere. Did not make it into they're in the northern hemisphere, but they're not above latitude 40 degrees north. They were not showing up in Europe or Siberia, anywhere like that, and they're not showing up in Australia either. Yeah. So the movement of our own immediate ancestors starts at 60,000 years at the latest. I mean, we have a skull in Israel that dates to about 55,000 years at Menach Cave. That's fully modern. That's us. That's ourselves. Presumably, that's one of these lineages, maternal lineages like L3, or possibly one of the basal Eurasian lineages. The maternal lineages are MN and R. We recently got confirmation that this group of archaeological assemblages that is known as the initial Upper Paleolithic show up very early, show up about 45, maybe even 48,000 years ago in places like Eastern Europe, South Central Europe, the Balkans, places like that. Also show up in Southern Asia relatively early. That they were made by ourselves, our own immediate ancestors. And as a matter of fact, all three of those basal Eurasian maternal lineages, MN and R, have now been identified in association with initial Upper Paleolithic artifacts at Bachokira Cave in Bulgaria. That was published earlier this year in Nature. This is taking place. This is starting at some point then around 60,000 years ago at the latest. And actually, some of the genetics suggest that it may be even earlier, because we have the divergence of some of these very early Eurasian lineages. Like there's a paternal lineage that's thought to diverge as early as, I think, about 77,000 years ago. And so in my book, I used I suggested a time range of somewhere between 60 and 75,000 years ago. The conservative estimate, the safe estimate based on the archaeology and the dated fossils and stuff would be, around 60,000. We have people in Australia certainly by no later than 50,000. Some people think somewhat earlier than that, 55,000. I believe we have some sites in New Guinea that date to a little bit more than 50,000. So that's probably at least a slight underestimate when people show up in Australia, New Guinea. And we have modern humans in Western Siberia up at latitude 57 degrees north. That's the subarctic zone at a place called Ust-Shim. And that's dated to 45,000. That's a human leg bone, and it's again one of those basal Eurasian lineages, maternal lineage R, which is a daughter lineage of N, which is closely related to the last of the African lineages, L3.
So, do we know the reasons why Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa? I mean, did it have something to do with climate, the climate conditions back then, or something like that?
Well, I think the thing is that all populations have the potential for infinite increase, right? And so I think the more logical question to ask, I think, from a biological or an evolutionary biology perspective is, why isn't it taking place? What's keeping them down? In order to illustrate the reproductive potential, the population growth potential of populations, Darwin used the elephant as an example, right? Because they're very slow breeders, very long gestation time, and there's some calculations. I think they're quoted in the Modern Humans book that within 500 generations, you're talking about over 1 million elephants or whatever. Yeah. So so the question really is why didn't they move out of Africa before? Of course, my inclination is to look at the ability to deal with environments where you have either scarce resources, you have a significantly lower biological productivity, it's more difficult to find enough to eat, and places where you have extreme winter temperatures that require these complex technologies that only ourselves, the subset of modern humans that we represent, were able to design. And if people then were only developing this significantly expanded computational power, say 75 or 80,000 years ago in Africa, in southern Africa, then that presumably would be a major constraint on earlier movements out of Africa. That would limit you to these places that we see these earlier modern humans who only get as far as the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, maybe southern Asia. You'd have this much more limited geographic range then, because of your limited ability to deal with these very different, more challenging environments. So that's I suspect that was a critical factor. There's dramatic changes in climate that are taking place during this whole period that we're discussing here. 100,000, 90,000, 75,000, 50,000 years ago. There are all such dramatic changes taking place, not only in the northern hemisphere in terms of extreme cold and glacial advances, that sort of thing, but also in the southern hemisphere in terms of major changes in moisture and the distribution of moisture. And so there are a number of my colleagues have suggested that changes in the monsoon pattern may have rendered the southern Arabian Peninsula, for instance, habitable only at certain times during that period. And so that would have been presumably a very important variable as well. But I think in terms of being able to to reach all these places like Australia and live in all these places like Beringia. Ultimately, it seems to me it comes down to this ability to design all these very complex technologies.
Mhm. Do we know if things like population density and resources, basically the ones that were taken as food, played a role in that as well?
Um, I'm not sure I understand quite what you're getting at.
Okay, so I'm asking if population density also explains why, different communities or populations spread around a wider area, because resources would be depleted if they stayed in
Yeah,
the
okay,
area.
you mean the pressure of population growth. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's, ultimately that's driving it, right? Because that's
yeah,
presumably the African population is growing,
yeah.
and it has to expand, and people have to, there just isn't enough food for everybody to eat, so they start moving out to the margins and looking
Mhm.
for new places to live, and that ultimately has to be the real driver, as it usually is for population expansion. And I think you have to remember that resources again are in most parts of Africa are much richer than they are in most places in Eurasia. Certainly in northern Eurasia, where it's cooler and drier, and plant animal resources are considerably less rich, and food resources are less dense. They're more scattered. You got to forage more widely to just to stay where you are in terms of food supply. Um, so ultimately I think that's a key factor.
Mhm. So we have Homo sapiens spread across Eurasia. Do we know when they first get in contact with Denisovans and Neanderthals?
Yeah, there seem to, according to the genetics, there are a series of interbreeding events that take place at different estimated times. And I've forgotten all of the details here, but there's at least like five or six interbreeding events that take place at different times in different places, in places like in the Levant, in Europe, in Asia, involving there's interbreeding going on also between the Denisovans and the Neanderthals as well. So it's
Mhm.
it's all three. Um, it's a menage a trois, and uh, that's also taking place here. Sure.
Mhm. And I guess this is a contentious issue, but do we know why the Denisovans and Neanderthals went extinct? Did Homo sapiens play a role there?
My own suspicion is yes, but as you say, it's a very controversial issue, and
Mhm.
many of my colleagues disagree strongly with that. But to me, it looks relatively straightforward. Modern humans, move into Eurasia, they move into the Levant, into Europe, into southern Siberia, and the Neanderthals and Denisovans don't exist anymore. So I think it's a complex process, obviously, since all this interbreeding is involved, and there's obviously some overlap in
Mhm.
in the periods in which both or maybe even all three of these populations of these stacks are living in the same place at the same time.
Mhm.
But ultimately, it looks to me as though modern humans is the key variable, key
Mhm.
driver.
And when did we reach America, and how did we do that?
Well, okay, so the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, presents a special problem
Mhm.
because clearly modern humans uh, are adapting to virtually every habitat and climate zone in the other hemisphere,
Mhm.
um, in Africa, Eurasia, and also in Sahel and in Australia, New Guinea, by certainly by 33,000 at the absolute latest. I suspect it's probably earlier than that, but We don't, at this point, we don't have any, absolutely incontrovertible evidence, indisputable evidence of people up in the Arctic, before about 33,000. But nevertheless, so we have, clearly people can deal with Beringia, and there's a land bridge there. Because of lowered sea levels, there is in fact an extensive plain, an enormous plain it's like, at least 1,200 kilometers in width, from north to south. And so there's a great controversy as to why people are not showing up, at least widely, in the Western Hemisphere until after about 15,000.
Yeah.
There's, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, there's been controversy for many, many decades, in fact, over a century, as to whether or not we have people in the Americas at a significantly earlier date. But I think I think almost all my colleagues, or most of my colleagues, would agree that we don't see widespread evidence of people in the Americas until after about 15,000, and then it's very rapid. Then we have sites all over the place, and there's no dispute about it, both in North and South America. So what accounts for this seeming delay in the widespread dispersal of modern humans in the Western Hemisphere? How come, since they're living in Beringia so early, and clearly they're dealing with virtually every habitat and climate zone in the old world, how come they it takes so long for them to disperse widely in the Americas? My own belief at this point is that it's the coalesced ice sheets. You have an enormous ice mass, the North American ice complex, which comprises both the Laurentide ice sheet, which spread out of the Greenland and northern Canada, eastern Canada, and the Cordilleran ice sheet, which spread out of the northern Rocky Mountains. And they join up by about before 50,000 years ago, and apparently are completely blocking any access, at least in the interior, from the interior of Alaska, Yukon, down into the northern plains. They also apparently are blocking routes along the coast, which is almost completely glaciated for until about maybe 16,000, when we get there's evidence of early retreat of ice along the coast, and that coincides, of course, with the evidence for this very rapid, widespread dispersal of the Native American ancestral group. So I suspect it's the ice. Now, a large number of my colleagues, and I once accepted this argument myself, as a matter of fact, believed for a very long time that the ice was really not a critical factor, and that the reason why we don't have people in the Americas until so late is because of the challenge of Beringian environments, that either conditions were so cold up there, or resources were so scarce, were so poor, either in part or all of Beringia, that even modern humans were unable to cope with those environments until the end of the Pleistocene, until the end of the Ice Age. But again, we know, we've learned in the last 20 years that that's not the case, that people were dealing with these environments. They were thriving, in fact, in places like the high Arctic, like among the Yana River sites. And so I think by default it has to be the blockage created by these coalesced ice sheets that's the key factor.
Mm-hmm. So humans reach North America, then they colonize North America, Central America, and South America. How long does it take exactly?
Well, it looks as though once people get going, once they get south of the ice, out of Beringia, it looks as though both the growth of the population and the dispersal across the Americas is extremely rapid. It's taking place certainly less than 2,000 years, according to the genetics, and even less than that according to the archaeology. I mean, we have sites in the southernmost part, South America, that are well over 13,000 years, and at this point, we have probably the earliest reliably dated sites we have up in North America, again, outside Beringia. We might have there's older stuff in Beringia, but in places like, the Northern Plains, or the Northwest, sites like Paisley Cape and so forth. The earliest reliable dates we have in these are, somewhere between 14 and 15,000. We have some dates actually earlier than 15,000 that were published just this last year from a site in Idaho, Cooper's Ferry. So that might be even slightly earlier than that, if those dates are correct.
Mm-hmm. Do we know if these Homo sapiens populations already had some form of agriculture? Because I was just thinking that 15,000 years ago, it was already very close to the period where, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, people developed agriculture. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, what's coming first, it seems, is sedentary life, village life. That's coming even before we have evidence for a widespread plant domestication. Of course, animal domestication is even older. I mean, because people are domesticating dogs, for example, at least 20,000 years ago, maybe earlier. And then there's other evidence we have for sedentary life, settled life. In places like South China, we've got pottery that's 20,000 years old. Also in Japan, we have very early pottery there that's, I think, at least 18,000 or so. I mean, that's we're talking about the middle of the last glacial maximum there, or at least the latter part of the last glacial maximum, when temperatures were extremely cold in the northern hemisphere. So that seems to be the lead up to widespread agriculture, is this evidence of sedentary life. And I would say, by the way, I think again it's the ability to develop all this very complex technology that underlies that. I mean, the Neanderthals were living under similar conditions in the past. Neanderthals, Denisovans, other early humans were living in places where the climate was essentially the same. Environmental conditions were the same, and yet there's obviously no evidence of settled life and of widespread domestication of plants and animals. And I think that too can be traced to this ability to design all this very complex technology.
Yeah. What about the question about the extinction of megafauna? Because that seems to be another controversial issue. And I mean, when humans arrive in particular places like Australia and North America, very quickly, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective, we see the extinction of certain species. So is it a coincidence, or were there other factors behind it? What's your take on that?
Well, this sort of, in some ways, parallels the question about the role of modern humans in the extinction or the disappearance of the Neanderthals and Denisovans. I think it's the same thing. It's impossible to be sure. It's impossible to eliminate the alternatives and to determine what variable is most important here. But I think once again, just the simple coincidence has to be significant. Modern humans show up and all these extinctions occur. I mean, what can you say? Climate clearly is undergoing a major change at this point, and obviously there's plenty of extinctions that take place before modern humans show up. But nevertheless, there is this very striking wave of extinctions that appears to accompany the dispersal of modern humans, and that's particularly true in these places like Australia and in the Americas, and also in Beringia, by the way, too, northern Siberia and stuff. So I suspect the modern humans are playing a major role in it. But again, it's just impossible to weigh the various it's impossible to assess the weight of the other variables, and to be sure exactly how much of it is due to human hunting and how much of it is due to climate change and its impact on vegetation and other species. But I would, at the very least, I would argue that humans have to be playing a significant role in it.
So there are certain questions regarding our evolutionary history, our evolution, and perhaps the impact we had in different environments that, I mean, we will never have a definite answer to them.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll may be able, it's going to be a methodological issue, right? It may be that we'll develop some new methods in the future that, we'll be able to control the variables more precisely, more effectively. So I wouldn't rule that out.
Okay, so
what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in paleoanthropology has been, almost beyond belief. What we've been able to do, I think, particularly is the ancient DNA. And also things like stable isotope analysis of human bones, what we're able to deduce from that about human diet. But I think particularly the ancient DNA and what that tells us about not only about relationships among past groups and populations, but also the population density and growth and all that sort of thing. I think it's just been utterly amazing, and I think it's totally transformed paleoanthropology, study human evolution, and I think it's having an enormous impact in archaeology, and it hasn't quite hit with full force yet. It's like a storm building out at sea. It hasn't quite hit the land yet, but I think it's ultimately going to change archaeology in a very profound way.
Yeah, let's see how things go in the future. So just one last question regarding human races. I mean, I'm sure that you will have a take on that because we spread across almost the entire world, and different human populations were exposed to different environmental conditions, let's say ecological conditions. And of course, we have differences, we can find differences, anatomical differences, for example, between different human populations. Can we talk about human races, or is that something unscientific, let's say?
Well, there are these geographical groups in the genetics, in the human genetics. I mean, you can show that we have these geographical races because you have these groups of certain traits that have a geographical basis. But I think, generally speaking, the question of the geographic races is intimately related to the question of modern human evolution and dispersal. Darwin, when Darwin wrote his book on human evolution in 1871, he said that he wrote it there were three main reasons why he wrote it. One of those reasons was to deal with what was then a popular view known as polygenism, which was the idea that the major races had evolved independently, okay, and were different species. Okay, Darwin thought this was absurd, and he argued, the argument he laid out was fundamentally the same argument that I'm laying out on modern humans, which is that modern humans evolved quite recently in one fairly limited geographic area. In this case, again, it looks like Southern Africa, and then that group spread to the rest of the world, effectively replacing, despite the interbreeding and stuff with the local populations, effectively replacing all other forms of human. That carries with it the strong implication that the variations, the biological variations, genetic variations among living people are relatively limited because we're all closely related, right? Everybody's descended from, a single male and a single female who were living in Africa, whatever it is, 80,000 years ago or something. Okay, so that's so. So the human, even the most what people think of as the most extreme racial variations are the product of no more than a couple thousand generations, which is certainly not much in terms of evolutionary biology. And that's, of course, particularly true when we realize that most of our lives are dominated by this non-genetic component, right? The culture and all the stuff that we create out of the non-genetic information that we share and that we learn. So I think there's some discussion in the Modern Humans book about this, about the relationship between the global dispersal of modern humans and the recent origin in one particular place to the question of the geographic races. And the argument from someone from my perspective would be that the similar to what Charles Darwin was arguing in the 1870s is that the variations are relatively trivial. The biological variations are relatively trivial because we are all closely related, and we're the product of this relatively recent dispersal from one particular place.
So, how should we think about those, let's say, obvious anatomical differences that exist between populations that until recently were fairly isolated from one another, or at least didn't contact that much among them?
Well, some of that variation does obviously reflects local environmental conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, heavy pigmentation is an adaptation to ultraviolet radiation, protecting against the deleterious effect of skin cancer and so forth. There are some differences in stature and in the length of extremities and so forth, arms and legs and so forth, that are related to temperature regime, whether it's very cold or very hot. The size of the head, of the cranium, tends to vary again according to temperature regime. People who live in the tropics tend to have a smaller head because it's a large head is difficult to keep cool in that climate, and so people living in the Arctic have the largest heads. Okay, the largest crania are found among Arctic peoples who've lived in the Arctic zone, like the Inuit, the northern Greenland Inuit, for example. So there are some variations that are related to climate or again ultraviolet radiation. And there are some local adaptations to pathogens, to disease pathogen, like malaria, mm-hmm. In the tropical zone. And then there are a lot of variations that simply reflect random variation. I think if you have a population that's spreading very rapidly, you're going to have significant founders effect, right? You're going to have people showing up. Let's say the first modern humans to show up in some place like Siberia. They're not going to carry perfectly statistically perfect statistic sample of the entire human population, right? They're going to inevitably, you will have some random variation there in terms of traits. People might have larger eyes or bigger thumbs or something than the average than other human populations, and they may become fixed in the population simply through genetic drift. There are some traits that are likely to be they have no effect on our adaptability, on our fitness, but they're likely to be driven by sexual selection. Okay, they may arbitrarily become a feature that's attractive to one sex or the other sex, and so you have selection for a certain type of nose or eyes or whatever. That's again in a sense sort of random, in that it's just some feature that has no effect on your fitness, but it's being selected for in terms of mating choice. So there are a number of factors involved here, but the bottom line is that there hasn't been enough time to develop any significant variation, so that the geographic races that we see are they don't, from an evolutionary biological point of view, they don't represent, significant divergence in the human population.
Mhm. Okay, so Dr. Hoffecker, let's end on that note. Just before we go, where can people find you or your work on the internet?
Well, I have a website at my institute, the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, University of Colorado. So that has a list of past publications and research interest and that kind of thing. And then I have a lot of stuff loaded up on the ResearchGate site. So if you're interested in particular papers, you can find most of them there, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview. And again, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show and to talk to you, Dr. Hoffecker.
Same, my pleasure entirely.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to consider making a pledge on Patreon. I have the link in the description box, or on PayPal. You can also find the links there. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters on PayPal: Karen Litzke and Blanchett, Peroga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunde, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Ethan Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, and Diego Londoño Correa. My producers: Isar Webe, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran. And my executive producers: Michal Rojewski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.